Good morning, everyone. I'm Laureen DeBuono, Managing Partner at FLG Partners, which is the leading interim CFO and board advisory firm in the United States, and we serve clients globally. Welcome to our 9th edition of CFO Insights. Today, we're happy to have FLG partner Anne Samak de la Cerda join us for lessons learned by an international consumer and healthcare technology company CFO. So welcome, Anne. Before we begin, let me tell you a little bit about Anne and her background. So Anne has spent her 20-plus year career working as a strategy and finance executive at numerous consumer health technology companies, with a focus on scaling operations and successful exits on the international stage. She has assisted companies to navigate the challenges of high growth, including access to capital in both Europe and the United States, as well as M&A, restructuring, and exits. Anne enjoys implementing forecasts, implementing processes, and driving structural changes, which improve demand planning, forecasting, cash management, and people management across geographies, industries, and companies. So welcome, Anne. We're so delighted that you've joined us at FLG and today for our chat with our audience. So let's begin our conversation. Are you ready, Anne?
Yeah, I am. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so prior to joining FLG, Anne, you spent 15 plus years of your career working for both consumer and healthcare technology companies, both private and public. So can you give us a snapshot of a few of the key roles you've had during your career and tell us a little bit about what you believe that you accomplished in these roles?
Yeah, I'd love to, Lauren. Thank you. I started my career in the UK, where I originally worked for PwC, primarily focused on strategic transactions and M&A in the telecoms industry. And then I took on several roles, mostly in strategy at Vivendi, a media conglomerate in France that had deployed billions on an acquisition spree, buying up internet startups meant to complement its core media business, And it was there at the time of the dot-com bubble burst that I first saw a CFO running through the office, literally screaming for cash.
I remember those days.
Yeah, it was a valuable lesson for me about the perils of overpriced acquisitions and the shaky business models that can result from those. I'm originally from France, and that's where I spent my first roles as a CFO. 10 years into my career, I joined the team at Legit.com, a publicly traded online shopping guide network. And in addition to building the organization for the finance and people function there for the first few years, we were able to close and integrate 2 acquisitions in Germany, which essentially nailed the company's competitive positioning in the European market. And this was also a key valuation advantage when the company was acquired 5 years later, After Legit, I was at CFO at the Withings, a pioneer in connected health, which I joined at an earlier stage of development. Withings was a totally different tech business with beautiful consumer products. I still wear their watches here and use their connected scale. So the business with complex supply chain issues, in addition to being a rapidly growing company, which you often see in the tech sector. My role there as CFO was to scale operations, again, from accounting systems to strategic finance, in preparation for a successful strategic sale to Nokia in 2016 for about $200 million. That's when I relocated to the Bay Area. And I stayed on at Nokia as the divisional CFO for 2 years, and then led the process to spin off the business again from Nokia. Lots of stories there. From there, I joined another consumer electronics company as CFO. I worked hard in that position with the board and management team to try to rescue the company from going under, but unfortunately, we failed. I can share more about this experience as we dig into different topics in our interview, but that was a unique experience for sure. After joining FLG in 2020, I worked as a consulting CFO, first in medical devices, but later expanded my scope to new sectors from edtech to consumer marketplaces and B2B SaaS. And as a fractional CFO, I've raised capital, led turnaround efforts, and evaluated and built teams and processes at multiple companies. I also spent considerable time hiring CFOs, actually, to take over after me as I assisted my clients through transition periods.
And that's what we often do, right, at
Yeah,
FLG, which is we come in as the interim, and then ultimately we work with the CEO in terms of bringing in our successor. So that happens a lot.
good.
And when you go over your experience, and what a great mix of experience in your career. And that's interesting about the sale of the deed to Nokia, because Nokia certainly back in the day was the company that used this Pac-Man strategy, if you recall, to just gobble up every potential competitor or adjacent company in the areas. So interesting. I don't know how they're doing quite right now, but
Yeah.
fascinating background. So let's get back to your career. And I know you've worked across geographies and cultures to implement new business processes at a number of international companies that have global operations. So how has that framed your perspective, Anne, as a CFO?
Yeah, my biggest learning as a CFO operating internationally is definitely around the importance of company culture and how difficult the topic of multicultural backgrounds remains for so many at the corporate level. And I have found that cultural gaps are strongest when a company's corporate culture is nascent or changing, right, at the early days.
Mhm.
As a CFO and in the context of implementing new processes, this has meant that I've had to adapt the way I communicate internally as a leader. My objective is always that no matter how deep in the organization a person is, they always understand what's expected of them and why. And that means different things for different cultures.
Mhm.
A second area I found is key in international work is how important it is to build a solid cross-entity FP&A infrastructure as early as possible. I've seen countless cases of inconsistent chart of accounts and accounting software across countries and entities, sometimes due to M&A. And this essentially renders the work of any finance professional inefficient and potentially inaccurate. So I found that untangling actual performance information from currency effects, for example, as a result of poor financial infrastructure, especially in the case of a growing company with multiple millions in revenue, is really painful.
That's interesting, Anne, because I've had the same experience, particularly with CPG companies. And one in particular, I came into the company because so many people had come into the finance organization from multiple other companies, and they brought all their little financial shortcuts with them. So I came in as interim CFO to a public company that was in the billions of revenue. And we literally spent a year restating multiple years of financial statements because of just what you said, untangling inaccurate financial records. That's no fun. It's not a fun job for a CFO,
Yeah.
but it does happen. Absolutely. Let's now turn to one of our more favorite topics, which is raising capital. So tell us about raising capital in your experience and the unique challenges that you felt by international companies that are trying to obtain financing for growth.
Sure, yeah. I've raised capital for many companies at different stages of growth. And a key focus of mine has always been to make sure to align expectation about how capital should be raised and deployed across both existing shareholders and founders. This is not an uncommon issue at later stage rounds, particularly, and I have found that adding the international dimension often exacerbates potential investor-founder misalignment. Also, the fundraising process is different depending on the geography the company is in. For example, in Europe, it's not uncommon to hire a boutique banker to help with the fundraising process, no matter how mature the company is. Here in Silicon Valley, I found that hiring bankers for capital raises is only acceptable in certain contexts and is less common for early stage companies, where actually the CEO and the CFO is often expected to project manage the whole process. Another difference between domestic and international fundraising occurs around employee stock option or ESOP programs. Expectations around how much capital should be reserved for employee stock option programs have often been widely different when talking to US investors versus European investors. At least that's my experience.
Absolutely. You raised two good points here. The first is regarding Silicon Valley capital raises. You're absolutely right. Particularly early stage companies, it's a no-no, right, to bring on an banker, because the whole belief is that your VC network plus yourself as CEO and your CFO can do it. So very, very interesting, that difference between Silicon Valley and European early stage company capital raises. And then with regard to options, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it, it just seems like it's wildly different, right? The employee expectations on getting options in a US-based company versus Europe. What do you think, Anne?
Yeah, totally. I mean, in the US, employees can expect much higher percentage of capital for stock option. You know, they can expect collectively between 10 and 20% of the capital in early rounds, versus in Europe, expectations are much lower there. And another difference is that, you know, during the hiring process, European hires can be taken by surprise about questions they are asked when being hired, and vice versa, right? Around those ESOPs.
Totally get it. But it is very stark, because I've worked in French companies where the expectations of the employees versus the US in terms of options is very, very different. Let's pivot a little bit and talk about acquisitions and integrations, because I know you've been right at the center of several acquisition integrations in your experience. So tell us a little bit about those experiences and what you learned as the CFO who leads those efforts.
Yeah, that's right, Laureen. I've been both on the acquire on the buy side, as well on the acquire on the sell side when it comes to M&A.
Mm-hmm.
And the key learning for me has been around how important it is to move fast down integration path after an acquisition, in particular with regard to financial systems and the cadence of financial reporting, but also in all sales related matters. And I found that, unfortunately, when a startup is acquired, you know, most companies do not benefit from the acquirer having world-class expertise in integration of people, systems, and processes. Sorry, that is unless you're being acquired by Cisco or Microsoft, for example. But so basically, the success or failure of that integration is often left to a few corporate sponsors and often unexperienced finance teams, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen mistakes made when companies attempt to protect their sales team, for example, from rapid integration for the sake of avoiding distractions to the business. And unfortunately, in my experience, this often ends up badly in the long term. I've also learned that during acquisition integrations, keeping financial reporting lines clearly separated from the business is a first essential step to ensure that finance can act as a catalyst for integration decision-making.
You know, I couldn't agree with you more. I've done a lot of integrations in my pre-FLG career. And the one thing that I noticed is integrations have to move much more quickly than they typically do. And one of the areas is what you pointed out, which is integration of sales teams. The slower you move, what happens is these sales guys who have probably lots of other options, they get nervous. They're either sitting there, or they decide to move to another company, or they're just waiting to know if they're going to be picked, right, as part of the new team. And what I've seen is that you've got sales members that are just laying in wait, not knowing what to do. And what ultimately happens is that sales ebb. So I agree with you that integrations need to take place more quickly, particularly if you want to mesh different cultures as well, right? Because you can take too long hanging on to those old cultures, those old business practices, and never the twain shall meet in terms of the companies really integrating well together. I've seen a lot of that. Yeah. So I completely agree. So pivoting now to your working with CEOs and how you as a CFO work with them, what has been your best experience working with the CEO, and why was it so rewarding?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I've had many great experiences working with CEOs, and actually I remain in close contact with all of them, frankly, to this day. Mm-hmm. And I think if I had to pick one story, I would pick one where we've had to go through very challenging times together, and where that CEO-CFO partnerships needed to be the strongest. Mm-hmm. I've had multiple examples of that, working closely with the CEO across the course of my career, from navigating a hostile takeover situation at Laguide to managing through dysfunctional board at a company I won't mention. But let me pick one, my one bankruptcy experience. Unfortunately, I joined that company after a long CFO vacancy, and it became obvious to me very early on that we were not going to be able to survive or even have a very gracious exit. So my role as CFO was really to prepare for all the possible ugly scenarios. I needed to help guide the CEO back to reality and show him how we could optimize our situation under the current circumstances. For instance, to stop some operations before it became too late to pay out any severance or medical coverage for all employees that we had to let go. Oof. And while it was exhausting emotionally, it was very rewarding to navigate through those tough times together. It became a great partnership between the two of us, and I learned obviously a lot, and obviously he learned a lot too.
That's a great story, because oftentimes the stories aren't as good as you mentioned, in the sense that I've worked with a lot of CEOs who can be very overly optimistic, right? Because they want everything to work. And sometimes when cash is low and they're getting close to that insolvency situation, they don't really understand what winding down a company means, the zone of insolvency, the fact that you have to make sure that you have money set aside, right? For payroll, wages, accrued PTO, and all of that sort of thing. So you, right, as the CFO, really need to educate them, and that's not easy. So kudos to you that you actually had a good experience doing that, because it can be tough. Yeah. So going to the flip side of the issue, what was your most challenging experience working with the CEO, and which one was that, and how did you work through roadblocks?
Yeah, I think my most challenging experience working with a CEO was when I worked with a CEO who was a very sharp individual, but had no business sense whatsoever and kept ignoring the numbers that they were seeing. It didn't help that the board, which can sometimes be an ally for the CFO, was also very detached from the realities of the current and projected performance. Very strange. I'm usually very patient, but frankly, I grew increasingly impatient with so much negligence going on at the company. I eventually managed to open the eyes of the CEO through building a trustful relationship and being very straightforward and direct in my communication. And I suggested, for example, that we cut one budget line by 80% to get closer to industry benchmark. I mean, I'm talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we did, And I was surprised at the positive response from the rest of the management team to this initiative on my behalf. They were just waiting for someone to trigger the alarm and force a reaction on the part of the leadership. Eventually, we worked successfully together to reduce costs by about 50% overall. It was difficult, but, we made it.
That's interesting that you mentioned this whole issue of the others in the C-suite that were just kind of waiting for someone to trigger the alarm, because I've noticed when I have worked in more young companies, where you have young C-suiters, you have a young set of executives in the C-suite, and they are working with, let's say, a CEO who's highly charismatic, very optimistic, and they may not understand all the issues that might be on the table, and they're reticent, right, to do so. They kind of stick to the work in their lanes. So again, the CFO needs to be the one always to kind of step up, ask the tough questions, and sometimes educate not only the CEO but the C-suiters in general with regard to kind of what's happening and what are the right scenarios or the path to go to, so to speak. So very interesting. So we have one last question for you, Anne, before we say goodbye, so to speak. And as we head into 2024, we really don't know what's happening in the outer market. But in terms of your role at FLG and the kinds of things you want to work with, tell us about your future areas of focus.
Yeah, great question. Thanks for asking. I mean, I've spent the most of my time in, after doing a lot of fundraising in the last 18 months at FLG, I spent a lot of time helping founders realign their business and operating plans with the realities of their markets, both commercially and from a fundraising perspective. And as a CFO working with the management team, acting as a check and balance, using facts and evidence-based arguments to my recommendation is the part of my work that I enjoy the most, particularly as I work to scale up businesses and expand them in an international context, right? So I hope I can continue this type of work for both consumer and business technology-centric companies as we move forward into 24.
And I think you will be able to. It'll just be interesting to see how the market operates in 2024. If, in fact, capital markets open, you might find yourself immersed in additional fundraising things, right, for companies. Yeah. But if they don't, then I agree with you that there's going to be continuation of a lot of working with founders, early stage companies, middle stage companies in terms of realigning some of their business and operating plans to just make for sure that they can kind of get through what could be a good year, what could be, a year of economic uncertainty. And with the presidential election, it'll be interesting. But you have a great background, Anne. And, my wish for you is that you find a lot of opportunities at FLG that play to your strong suits, because you have a lot of them. So I wanted to thank you for joining us today, Anne, and thank you to the audience for listening to Anne's perspectives in terms of her experience as a very internationally savvy consumer and healthcare technology CFO. So I hope, audience, that you enjoyed our conversation. Thank you again, Anne, and happy holidays to everyone of you in the audience. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Laureen. Bye.